Is feminism an indulgence? Or more provocatively, are women's rights an indulgence? Perhaps even an illusion? According to controversial male chauvinist podcaster Andrew Wilson of The Crucible, yes, women's rights are an illusion.
Because even if they do have equal rights, it's just because men have allowed them to.
But does that make women's equality laughable or like an absurd idea?
Well, it's paradoxical on its face, so it has to be laughable because there is never going to be such thing as women's equality, just an illusion thereof.
That is because, he argues, they can only be enforced ultimately by men.
Men are the enforcement arm of society. I do not believe that women can enforce their own rights and that only men can enforce their rights.
And if women's rights are enforced by men, he says, then it is men who, in practical terms, actually decide whether women have rights or not.
I'm saying that men have the monopoly on force. And because they have a monopoly on force, anytime they so choose, they can take the rights away from women, but it's never possible the other way around.
Indeed, in his eyes, it was men who gave women their rights. This is a big claim. And while Wilson is an admitted provocateur, he's getting at something quite important here. Because if women's rights are subject to the fluctuating whims of male agreeableness, then their rights would seem to rest on quite shaky foundations. And if women are unable to enforce their rights themselves, as Wilson argues, then what interests would men have in enforcing them at all? In this video, and 3 further ones that will follow, I want to explore these questions through the lens of trade-offs. This will allow us to engage with multiple conflicting visions about this, from the masculinists like Wilson who think men granted women their rights in a fit of misguided benevolence, to the feminists who think that women secured their rights through mass struggle and protest. However, I can tell you now that the conclusions I come to will likely surprise you as I go beyond conventional framings of gender relations to provide what I think is a more robust and satisfying understanding of these questions. I hope my approach here offers you a fresh take on how to think about gender relations, power, patriarchy, feminism, and women's rights. To start with, what are rights? They are entitlements that establish what you are free to do without restriction from the state or other actors. They also oblige you to respect those same rights for others. Okay, so where do rights come from? This is a long debated topic, but 4 viewpoints stand out. First, there is the natural rights tradition, connected to John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, who believed that rights derive from nature or reason and exist prior to any government. This had a major impact on the writing of the U.S. Constitution. Second, there is the dignity-based tradition associated with philosopher Immanuel Kant, in which rights flow from the inherent worth and rational agency of each person. This had a defining influence on the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the South African Constitution. Third, there is the interest-based theory as developed by philosophers Joseph Raz and James Griffin, which says that rights protect interests that are so fundamental that others have duties to respect them. An example would be where it is difficult to prove that a right holder has active choice or autonomy, such as with animal rights or children's rights. And lastly, there is the political-based or practice-based view as developed by scholars John Rawls and Charles Bates, who believe that rights are not metaphysical facts, but shared political standards for how states must treat individuals to be considered legitimate. This is popular with NGOs, aid organizations, and the UN Sustainable Development Group. According to Wilson, however, it is better to understand rights through the realist tradition of force theory. That is, instead of worrying about where a right comes from, we should focus on whether it is enforced or not, because enforcement reveals a society's real commitments. After all, a codified right that is not enforced is not much of a right at all. So then, how are rights enforced? Today, societies organize enforcement through a series of institutions that mediate the process. To ensure domestic compliance of rights, states have prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, police officers, detectives, National Guards, corrections officers, and other personnel to handle different enforcement tasks. They all rely on public legitimacy to operate effectively. To ensure international compliance of national sovereignty rights, states rely on militaries to deal with violations from foreign forces. Indeed, today, vast bureaucracies and specialized agencies make up the broad governmental enforcement arm of most modern societies. However, according to Wilson, despite its complexity, this modern iteration of rights enforcement is built on the same foundation as every other enforcement regime in history. That is, it is based on men, the actions of men, and especially the targeted deployment of violence by men. Male kinetic energy represents the final, indispensable backstop power for enforcing rights in any society. In interviews, Wilson often speaks of men as a collective unit of enforcement power. He is mainly referring to the fact that in most societies, all men of a certain age are required to serve in life-threatening combat operations against foreign belligerents during wartime. Indeed, throughout history, if a society faced an existential threat from outside its borders, men were collectively summoned to safeguard the survival of that society. This meant they engaged in and faced deadly violence. Women have almost never been asked to make this same type of total mortal commitment to enforce a society's right to exist. We can nuance Wilson's argument here for the more everyday enforcement activities within a society by saying that domestically, it is not all men who act as enforcers, but smaller groups of men who are tasked by society with enforcing rights. Today, these groups are the police, SWAT, FBI, National Guard, and so forth. But in prior times, they could have been posses, militias, bands of knights, mercenaries, or vigilante gangs assembled for a given enforcement action. Members of these units are the backstop enforcers of a society's rights internally. Of course, one might object that women also play a role in enforcement too. That is true. They play a major role in almost every type of enforcement activity. However, when it comes to who provides backstop power in an enforcement operation, meaning the last line of defense for securing our rights, it is overwhelmingly men. And historically, that would have been even more the case. So, if men collectively are the backstop enforcers of our rights vis-a-vis other states, and smaller groups of highly trained men are the backstop enforcers of our rights inside our societies, then men do appear to play an important role in the substantiation of a society's rights. perhaps even the decisive one. That is what Wilson argues and what force theory suggests. However, this description covers the enforcement of all of a society's rights, including women's rights. If this is the case, it begs some challenging questions for the conventional feminist understanding of this issue. The first question is, how did women get their modern rights? Was it given to them by men? Was it taken from men by women? Or were they developed in an entirely different manner? According to most feminist accounts, women agitated for their rights and basically took them. They collectively put so much pressure on men to give women various rights that men really had no other choice. Modern women were a power that could not be denied. This jibes with the mainstream feminist belief about how power changes. As the famous feminist Gloria Steinem says, power can be taken, but not given. The process of the taking is empowerment in itself. The former COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, echoes this sentiment, claiming social gains are never handed out. They must be seized. And Charlene Carruthers, a Black queer feminist organizer, agrees, stating, power concedes nothing without an organized demand. The assumption here is that the interests of those who have power are self-serving, static, and predictable. Thus, the only way to redirect power away from them is through antagonistic organized pressure and direct action. This is also the standard view across most activist movements. Back in 1857, famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Malcolm X said something similar a century later, that power never takes a step back, only in the face of more power. At first glance, this seems like an accurate description of how different groups gain greater rights. The organizational efforts of the activists appear to precede any change in power. Thus, their actions must be the causal mechanism that delivered the change. Certainly, when it comes to the history of how women's rights were achieved, most mainstream scholars agree with the activists who place women's actions at the center of the story. Women were the agents of their own destiny. They highlight the writings and actions of women like Mary Wollstonecraft, Abigail Adams, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Ida B. Wells, Alice Paul, and so on. And when you read their stories and imagine how invigorating it must have felt for these early pioneers of women's rights to see their cause gaining greater and greater legitimacy across society, then it is tempting to think that this is the core of the story of how women's rights came about. But force theory would suggest that it was not women who were the primary agents of change with regards to the elaboration of women's rights. They certainly agitated and pressed and cajoled, but force theory doesn't care about the entreaties, pamphlets, and rallies that propelled women's movements around the world. After all, people call for change all the time with no results. Hence, force theory only cares about the mechanics of hard power during key moments of potential change, which lead to questions like, if the all-male legislatures of the 1910s had refused to vote in favor of women's suffrage, is there anything women could have done to force those men to vote for them? And if not, is there anything they could have done to force the men out of legislative power so that they could exercise it themselves? The answer to both of these questions is no. By focusing on who has the controlling power at pivotal moments, and keeping in mind that men constituted the backstop power of the society already, force theory suggests that men had the controlling power at these times and could simply have shrugged off women's demands, knowing that there was no real threat to their own power. Indeed, in many places around the world today, women call for change, only for their pleas to be ignored. As Wilson argues, if men collectively want a right in force, it will be enforced. If they don't want it enforced, it won't be enforced. And there's nothing that anyone can do about it except other more powerful men. So, did women take power, as feminists suggest? Or did men themselves choose to expand women's rights and power, even though it might seem to diminish their own relative power? The short answer is that a large number of women sought an expansion of their rights at a very specific moment in history, and a majority of men were keen for the same. And so together they made it happen. However, the power over this process was largely in the hands of men who controlled the military, the economy, and politics. Thus, from a purely practical perspective, men are the responsible party here for delivering women's rights, as ironic or dissatisfying as that may sound. The second question that emerges from the idea that men are the backstop power for rights enforcement is, can women enforce their own rights? Well, practically speaking, no. But this pertains not just to women, but every group in society as well, including men. Every group needs the services of capable men, usually in the form of the police or the military, to enforce their rights, especially if those rights are being breached by other violent males. Now, could groups of women organize in such a way as to deploy effective force against the most extreme violators of women's rights and thereby become the enforcers of their own rights? Perhaps. With training and appropriate technology, groups of women might indeed be able to do that. But as of now, this is not something that they have chosen to do. I can imagine a number of evolutionary, biological, psychological, and social reasons why this has yet to be the case. But this does mean then that they do indeed rely on men to be the backstop enforcers of their rights. And yet, while force theory can help clarify how power operates at its most fundamental level, it also can obscure the role that mediating institutions have on rights enforcement today. Indeed, in most enforcement situations, the backstop power of highly trained police officers is not needed because the mere threat of arrest or incarceration can have the desired desistance effect on a potential offender. Hence, male and female prosecutors, judges, parole officers, social workers, HR administrators, activists, and even normal citizens like you and me can leverage the threat of backstop power to help enforce women's rights. Now, these institutional personnel are not capable of enforcing rights on their own, but by working with the agents of backstop power, they form a publicly legitimate, multi-layered enforcement apparatus that incorporates women at multiple levels into the enforcement of their own rights. Thus, we start to get a more nuanced and recognizable representation of how women's rights are enforced when we combine elements of force theory's focus on male backstop power with an institutionalist approach to mediating institutions and legitimacy. They form part of the same story of the elaboration and enforcement of women's rights, at least in the modern era. Hey, just real quick, if you appreciate good faith attempts to wrestle with contemporary social issues, guided by the logic of Thomas Sowell's dictum, there are no solutions, only trade offs, then do me a favor and click the like and subscribe buttons to keep up with new episodes as they come out. Now back to our discussion on force theory and women's rights. So, is Andrew Wilson correct in asserting that men gave women their rights and that men continue to protect women's rights as the backstop enforcers? Well, yes and no. I think Wilson is correct to bring in a realist framework of power to this question of women's rights. It offers a useful tempering to the mainstream feminist approach, which overemphasizes the role of women's acts of solidarity and protest in securing positive outcomes for themselves. There's an element of myth making in such heroic narratives. However, where I think Wilson's take falls short is in how he conceives of male power in the present. He often likes to ask a hypothetical question. If tomorrow men decided to stop enforcing women's rights, would women have any rights left? And he answers no, because the internal logic of force theory suggests that since men act as the backstop power of rights enforcement, then whatever they decide is what is actually going to happen, no matter what women might do.
Anytime collectively men say women have no rights, they don't have any. And that's that. And there's not a damn thing that they can do about it.
He often points to Middle Eastern societies like Iran to substantiate this point, in which it really does appear that men there largely agree that women should have limited rights, and thus that's exactly what we see in reality. But when we take that question to modern Western societies, the fact is, men are not a cohesive group that hold the same interests. They are split in which parties they vote for, in which policies they support, and in which ideologies they believe in. It's not a credible assumption that modern Western men would all of a sudden collectively agree to now hold a singular negative perspective on women's rights that the backstop enforcers would then act on. That's not how power operates in our societies today. In addition, in modern Western societies, it is not all men who are involved in domestic enforcement activities. Small groups of police take responsibility for most backstop enforcement in localized situations, meaning unanimity of voluntary male action is virtually impossible across a large society. If a group of men which has backstop power in one area decides not to enforce women's rights as they are supposed to, then other groups of men in outfits like the FBI or National Guards would likely take over enforcement duties. One group of stronger men would override the force decisions of another group of men. We have seen this happen before. Of course, it is not impossible that the men of these layered municipal, county, state, and federal enforcement units may all decide at the same time to not enforce women's rights, but the cross-cutting multi-level approach makes it far less likely to be a realistic possibility in the modern West. Yet while I'm arguing here that this scenario sounds mostly implausible, it is not impossible, especially if the military steps in and turns its awesome organizational and technological force against its own citizenry. Then all bets are off. And while this rarely happens in modern Western countries, it has happened many times in developing countries. Just since the end of World War II in 1945, there have been 470 successful military coups and more than 1,200 coup events. In many cases, the immediate effect of the chaos and insecurity that follows is a reduction of women's rights enforcement, along with other groups' rights as well. So while Wilson's hypothetical scenario may not be all that realistic in the West right now, it certainly is in many other societies. So, if men played a decisive role in giving women their rights, and if men continue to be the backstop enforcers of women's rights, then what are the implications of this argument? According to Wilson, because men gave women their rights, men can also take them back.
I don't understand why they should have equal rights to vote, why they should have equal rights to men, if they are not in the position where they can actually enforce their own rights and only men can.
But as we've discussed, this is not feasible in Western societies. This would require almost total unanimity by men, which doesn't exist. Wilson also believes that women should basically forfeit their rights because, since receiving them, they have failed to honor their obligations in what he conceives of as a grand social contract between men and women, in which men promise to provide and protect, while women promise to reproduce and nurture the children of the future. But now that women have greater rights, they have been able to earn their own money, becoming less reliant on men and their provision. With this enhanced financial independence, women make reproductive choices that often have nothing to do with building families, like having children outside of marriage or remaining childless. For Wilson, this is a disaster that was brought on by the extension of rights to women, and thus should disqualify them from being able to exercise them any further. As you can imagine, Wilson's pessimism about the utility of women's rights has attracted plenty of controversy, and I'm sure he wouldn't have it any other way. But I don't think his argument naturally derives from the insights he draws from force theory. After all, while it may be true that women cannot enforce their own rights, which he believes invalidates women's claim to them, there are plenty of groups in society that cannot enforce their own rights, and yet we still agree that they should have them, such as children, the disabled, and the elderly. Hence, I don't find Wilson's argument that men should take away women's rights persuasive, not only for the moral implications involved, but because I don't think Wilson understands why men were keen to grant women expanded rights in the first place, a point I will return to later. For the feminists who acknowledge the basic premise of force theory, the implications of this argument are that it provides yet more proof that men have too much control over women's lives and that they are not to be trusted because they will never give up their power freely. Men might make concessions to women by granting them various rights, but they will try to keep them subordinate so male power is never truly challenged. While most feminists do not overtly agree with force theory, their statements sometimes suggest that they think it might be operationally true. For instance, many feminists today still speak of Western societies as patriarchies, as if there is no qualitative difference between modern and pre-modern societies with regards to women's rights. They speak of male power as systemic, meaning that it suffuses every element of society. And they demand that men make space for women in various contexts of power, indicating that they don't really believe that power can just be taken from men. Because if you have to ask for it, then that's not quite the same thing as seizing it. In any case, I do not think that the conclusions most feminists come to about male power naturally derive from the actual history and experience of women in modern Western societies. And that is because, just like Wilson, most feminists fundamentally misunderstand why women got their expanded rights in the first place. For me, there are three major implications for the idea that men were ultimately the responsible party for granting women their rights, and that men are the backstop enforcers of women's rights. The first implication of this argument is that, in contrast to the masculinists and feminists who view gender relations as based primarily on conflict, I assert that gender relations within a society are actually largely based on cooperation. And when you look at the history of women's rights through that lens, you were able to move beyond the inadequate feminist explanations as to why patriarchy gave way to egalitarianism, why men gave women expanded rights when they did, and why men continue to enforce women's rights. When you view the history of patriarchy, feminism, and women's rights through a lens of gender cooperation, you get a much more robust and realistic understanding of how gender dynamics have played out across multiple societies throughout history. The second implication of this argument is that the development of women's rights was due mostly to structural changes, not moral improvement. After all, modern men are not more moral than pre-modern men. Rather, it was the enormous economic and social forces of the Industrial Revolution that drove the expansion of women's rights, playing a far greater role than feminist campaigning ever did in securing those rights. Thus, as agricultural economies gave way to industrial ones, so too did patriarchal structures give way to more egalitarian ones. That's not a coincidence. Men and women embraced an equal rights approach so as to better leverage the opportunities of industrialization and capitalism to enhance their own prosperity and to be able to compete against other rival nations who were also bringing women into the workplace and politics. The third implication of this argument is that women's rights are inherently unstable. Not so much because chauvinist men may want to bring back patriarchy, but because women's rights have tended to be calibrated according to the survival requirements of different types of societies. In hunter-gatherer groups, women had clear gender roles, but were relatively equal. In horticultural societies, they lived under mild patriarchal structures. In agricultural and pastoral societies, they lived under a strict form of patriarchy. In industrialized societies today, they live mostly freely and equally. And in transitional developing societies, they deal with competing patriarchal and egalitarian forces that vie for primacy. In the future, as population decline alters the economics and security of societies, the shape of women's rights is likely to change yet again. Now, while I believe these implications stem from how force theory relates to women's rights, I need to substantiate them with more evidence if they are really to have merit. So for my next three videos, I am going to do deep dives into each one of them, trying to provide truly persuasive arguments for why gender relations are based on cooperation rather than conflict, for why women's rights come from structural rather than moral forces, and for why women's rights are inherently unstable. And once we have done that, we'll then be able to answer the question I started this video with about whether feminism and women's rights are an indulgence or perhaps even an illusion. So you won't want to miss that. Please do like, subscribe, and comment below. Also consider sharing this video with a friend. It could be the basis for an interesting conversation, or it could be the end of your friendship. Either way, we live in a world of trade-offs, don't we?